Okay, so we are going to shoot a video here showing you how to disassemble and reassemble an Anver M100 model vacuum generator. We'll go over some of the tips and tricks on taking it apart, what to look for, and looking for any possible items that may need repair or lubrication. So the first step in taking apart the generator is removing the pin and the shackle from the top of the generator. So it's just a simple slide out pin. You can set the parts aside. The next step is to take off the 6 bolts holding the top of the generator to the housing, to use an M8 Allen key and just take the parts off as you go around. So once the bolts are off, you just have to pull the top cover off, nice and easy, set it aside. And then this top ring just pops off. Sometimes it gets a little hard from being on there, so it's just a matter of pulling it off, and then you can set that aside as well. And the next step is just pulling out the piston rod and the diaphragm. So just grab the piston rod and lift up on it. Sometimes you need to pull the diaphragm off just so you're not creating any vacuum suction, which will make it more difficult to pull out. And set that down to work this way. And the next step, so once we have the diaphragm pulled out of the generator, we'll look inside the housing to see if there's any dirt, debris, rust, anything that should not be in there, and then we'll get that cleaned out. Again, we want to try and keep the inside of the generator as clean as possible to keep any of the rubber parts being torn or ripped or being damaged over time. So we'll take a look inside and see what we find. So you can see inside the generator there's some small little chunks of steel and some dirt in there. So to clean that out, we can either use a vacuum or compressed air and just blow the particles out of there. There's no rust or any flaking paint off the side, so we don't have to worry about cleaning that off. If there was light rust or some paint starting to flake off the inside, you can use some emery cloth to clean that up and just sand the surface smooth again. So that's what we'll do next, is we'll clean out the inside of the generator here. So the next step is we're going to take a look at the diaphragm and further take apart the piston rod so we can do a further inspection of the internal components on the generator. What we'll do is we'll fold the diaphragm down, and you'll see another set of bolts that we can remove, and that will take this top plate off of the diaphragm so we can fully remove the diaphragm. And we use a 5mm wrench for that, or sorry, Allen. So this top plate will just come off with a bit of pressure, and then you can remove the diaphragm from the lower part of the housing. So the next step is to take a look at the diaphragm itself and give it a good inspection on the inside and the outside to look for any tears, cracks, or anything that may cause a leak in the generator. Even a small little tear in the diaphragm will cause a leak and does require the diaphragm to be replaced. So once you're done looking it over, it's a good idea to give the diaphragm a cleaning. If you need to get it wet or cleaned up well, it's best to use mild water, or soap and warm water just to get it cleaned off. And then you have to wait for the diaphragm to be completely dry, and then you can put talcum powder on there to give it the proper lubrication. Do not use oil or any harsh chemicals to clean the diaphragm, as that will damage the diaphragm and cause more problems when you go to put it back together and use the equipment again. So I'm just using a shop rag to try and wipe off some of the dirt off the outside of the diaphragm so I can give it a better look. Again, just go over it very closely, looking over the entire part to see if there's any tears or cracks. So once you've gone around the entire outside, you also want to look at the inner lip. There are times where you can put too much pressure when you're putting the bolts back on and cause a crack there, and that will create a leak in the vacuum generator. So again, go around the entire upper lip. Also look on the bottom of the generator or of the diaphragm, look for any cracks, again in any of the seams, just in the corners here. Again, same issue, if you tighten it too hard or in the improper sequence, it can cause some tears. And once you've done that, you want to turn the diaphragm inside out and again check on the inside and look in the same area. Again, go around the entire part, looking everywhere for any kind of damage, cracks, or tears. So I'm just showing you here on this particular diaphragm, the part number is etched right onto the part itself, and you may find that in other diaphragms as you take them apart. So if you do find a crack or tear, you should be able to find the part number right on here. If not, refer to your manual and parts list to get the proper part number, or with the serial number, Anver can identify the correct part for you. Okay, so we've just taken the diaphragm and cleaned it off with some water and some soap, just to give it a good clean and make sure it's ready to go. So as mentioned before, we're going to lubricate the diaphragm now with a talcum powder, and that's the only form of lubrication you should use on the diaphragm. So just put it on around the diaphragm, then just kind of rub it in to make sure you get powder into all the areas of the diaphragm. You want to do that on the inside, the outside, and then make sure you get the top and bottom lips as well, just so that everything is nicely coated and ready to go back into the generator when we're at that point. So there we go, it's ready to go back in the generator, but before we put things back, we'll continue taking the generator apart a little bit further. So, okay, so to continue our disassembly, we'll take the generator apart a little bit further. So we'll take this lower cover off here, and again, just to give it a quick look, see if there's any sharp edges or any damage to the part. There shouldn't be anything wrong with it, but take a quick look at it, and then you can also give it a wipe with your cloth just to clean it off, get rid of any dirt and debris that have come in there. And again, same with the inside, just give it a quick little wipe, or you can clean it with the compressed air as well. So on the side here, you can see a little bit of scoring of marks just from this part rubbing up against the side of the generator. So if you feel it's quite rough, you can again just take a piece of emery cloth just to get that smooth. Again, just helps everything function a little better inside the generator. So. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the mechanical valve assembly, which is the part that makes a generator on and off as you lift and lower the lifter. So we're just going to make sure that it is moving freely, that it's working properly to make sure everything's good. So basically you just take your hand and you push up on the valve assembly, and it'll stay lifted up away from the bottom plate, and then you push it again and it'll sit flush with the bottom. So do that 6 cycles, that way it goes through all the detents inside the valve, and that way you know it's working well. If it moves freely each time, then you're good to go. If you feel it sticking or jamming, you then need to take it apart a little further and see if you can fix it or get a replacement assembly. Okay, so assuming we need to further take the mechanical valve assembly apart, what we have to do is take out these 8 bolts off the top here. Sometimes it can be tricky to take them off just with the torque value that's on there and it being a smooth finished part. So if you need to, you can put it into a vise. Just make sure that you have a cloth or a rag or something over top of the vise so you don't cause any damage to the lower part here or onto the O-ring. So you just want to put it in gently and just snug enough so you can loosen them off, and then once the bolts are loosened, just take it out of the vise and continue to do it by hand. now that the bolts are out, we can take the valve assembly right out of the housing. So here you can see how the mechanical valve assembly works. It's just your simple 2 cycles there to attach and release. Okay, so now we're going to look at the piston bottom valve seat, another part that can be damaged and cause some vacuum leakage. So like the diaphragm, it's a rubber part, so we want to take it off, clean it, and then look for any tears or cracks in it. So it's just a simple peel off part here, and then once it's off, you can take a look at it on the inside and the outside. Again, peel it back, look for any tears or cracks on the inner edge here, and then on the bottom side again, look and see if there's any tearing or marks on the bottom. Any small little tears or anything in it, replace it again. It will cause a vacuum loss, so it's another critical part. Like the diaphragm, if it is dirty, clean it off with water and soap, and once it's completely dried, put the talcum powder on it as well to keep it properly lubricated. So again, like the diaphragm, just put the powder on there and rub it in throughout all the surfaces so everything is covered, and then it can be reassembled back onto the valve assembly. So it's fairly simple to take on and off. You just have to set one side of it on the lip of the valve assembly and then go around the housing to put back on. There, it's back on, just double checking that it's on the lip properly and everything's aligned. Okay, so now that we've got everything taken apart, lubricated, and any parts replaced, it's just a matter of putting everything back together. So before we go too far, we'll just give the bottom plate here a quick wipe just to get any dirt and debris off of it. Again, you can use the compressed air to clean out any parts as well. So take the mechanical valve assembly, just set it in the middle, and then take the 2 clamping rings and set them in place. And then get everything lined up with the bolt holes. Now it's important once you start to tighten things down that the gaps between the 2 parts are equal on both sides, just so that everything's fastened in the right spot. So again, just double check that these openings are the same on both sides before you put the screws in there and tighten them up. So as we're tightening these, just keep an eye on the gap between the parts because it will shift around on you a bit. You don't need to worry about putting these in any alternating pattern because there's no O-ring or anything underneath, so you can just go from one side or one bolt to the next. Again, the main important part of this is to make sure that the gap is equal on both sides. So once the bolts are on, just make sure that the O-ring is back in place and that it's not damaged or pinched or has any defects in it. And once that's in place, we put the plastic cover back over top, and it'll just fit in place, and then we can set the diaphragm on top. So when you're setting it in, you need to make sure that the lip on the diaphragm is in the lip of the lower part here, making sure everything's properly aligned. If it's not in there right, you can cause damage to the diaphragm, or the lifter may not work right when you go to put it back together, so that is very... Okay, so once the generator is set on top of the plastic part here, and we've got the diaphragm in the right grooves, we're going to put the top clamping ring in place. So it just sits on top, and it's a matter of lining up the bolt holes and making sure that the lips or the grooves on the diaphragm are still in the right place. Again, we don't want to cause any damage to the diaphragm or give the generator any problems as we go to put it back together and test it. So once that's set in place, we just have to put the bolts back in And with these parts, as we tighten them down, we want to do an alternating pattern. So basically go from one side to the next, so we're getting even pressure along the along the diaphragm, so that we're not pushing down on too hard on one spot. That was not very good English. So as we tighten up these bolts, so first you'll want to put them on just kind of finger tight as you come around, and then again, continuing your alternating pattern, you want to tighten up the bolts going across. You don't want to put everything on too tight. Again, you don't want to compress the diaphragm too much and cause damage to it. So just tighten it up until you feel some good resistance on there, and then keep on going around in your circle or in your alternating pattern. So once the bolts are all tight, again, it's a good idea just to go around the circle and just double check that all of them are tight. Again, just a quick little hand check. I've already done that, but basically you just want to go around and double check like that. So once that's in, just fold the diaphragm back up into the normal position. And then okay, so now that the bolts are tightened down, the diaphragm has been flipped back up, we're going to put the assembly back inside the generator housing. So it's just a matter of setting it in place gently and then making sure the lips on the top of the diaphragm are in the lip on the top of the housing. So we'll do that now. And lift it up, just set it in place nice and slow, and it should just fit in there. Okay, so as you set the assembly in there, just make sure that the lip of the diaphragm is seated properly all the way around. You can just run your fingers across there just to make sure everything's in place. Once that is good, it's just a matter of putting this upper extension on. And as you set it in there, again, you need to make sure that it's sitting properly on top of the diaphragm lip and that everything's sitting properly. And if it's not in the right spot or something's come loose, then you can cause damage to the diaphragm and create a tear and a leak, which is an issue. When you're putting this in, the actual position of the part doesn't matter. It's just a matter of making sure it's installed right side up. So again, you've got the two cutouts on the side here that represents the top, and you can also see the labeling is on up the proper way. So again, that's the only important parts there. So once that's in place, we put the top cover on. Just before we do that, I'm going to give this a quick wipe. Again, getting any dirt and debris outside. Now we'll put the top plate on, so it just slides over top of the valve or the piston here, and it should slide in nice and gently. If you do have some resistance, just kind of play around with it a little bit until it sets on there. It's just a matter of a tight fit in there, so you need to get that lined up. So then just spin the top plate so that it's lined up with the bolts holes underneath it, and then make sure that the lip on the top plate is inside the housing properly. And then we can tighten up our bolts. Like the last set on top of the diaphragm, you'll want to put them in an alternating pattern just so you tighten everything up nice and gently. First go around and get everything finger tight, and then put it in more securely with the wrench as you go around. As you tighten up the bolts, you've got them on there, just again go around the circle, make sure that they are all tight and everything secured properly. And then the final step is to get the shackle and the pin put back on top. So just take the assembly. Slide it into place and then put the pin in, and your lifter is put back together. So the next step, once you get everything put back together, is to do a load test again to make sure that there are no leaks, that everything's working properly. So best to find a sample piece of material that you can lift up. And as you're doing the test, just make sure that you're getting a consistent vacuum and that the piston is not extending out as you're doing the test again. If the piston's extending out during the load, that means there is a leak and there's something else that either wasn't set in properly or there's some further adjustments required. So this is just our load test after the vacuum lifter's been reassembled. So We'll lift it up just a couple inches off the table just to make sure everything's working properly. We're going to take a look at our gauges, making sure that they're reading the same vacuum level, and then we'll keep an eye on the piston to make sure it's not extending outward as we do the test. So we'll go ahead and do that. So now we've lifted up, you can see that both gauges are reading roughly the same amount. We've got 8.7 and it's about 8 or 9 on the analog gauge. And again, here at the piston is where we want to take a look at while we're doing our load tests. You want to let it sit here for 5-10 minutes and just make sure that the vacuum levels are staying the same and that this piston is not coming out any further. If it helps, you can just put a little marker line across the piston to see if it has moved or not. Again, if the piston is extending outward, that means that there could be a leak inside the generator or at the pads or hosing somewhere else. So this is just our proof that we have put the generator back together properly.